They recovered his body on a Tuesday. That was the part nobody could argue with. The part that made everything else feel undeniable. The physical fact of a man pulled from the water 3 miles off the coast of Virginia Beach, identified by his dog tags, his dental records, and a wedding ring I'd slid onto his finger 14 years ago, in a church so small the pews only held 40 people. Staff Sergeant Nathan Cole, 39 years old, communications specialist, 2nd Signal Brigade, Fort Liberty. My husband, the father of my son, found dead in the Chesapeake Bay, after what the Navy investigators called a boating accident, during an off-duty weekend trip with colleagues. That was the official story. I held onto it the way you hold onto a railing when the floor tilts beneath you, not because you trust it, but because letting go means falling. My name is Grace Cole. I'm 37. I'm a captain in the United States Army, an intelligence analyst who has spent the last 15 years learning to read situations the way most people read novels, looking not just at what's on the page, but at what the author decided to leave out. 3 deployments, 2 Bronze Stars, a security clearance high enough that I can't tell you exactly what I did overseas, only that it involved reading patterns in places where the wrong pattern could get people killed. None of that training prepared me for the chaplain's knock at 6:14 on a Tuesday morning. I was making breakfast. Eggs for Jackson, our 8-year-old, who had a math test that day and was nervous about long division. He was sitting at the kitchen table in his Captain America pajamas, erasing something in his workbook for the 3rd time, and I was about to tell him that the answer was 42 when I heard the knock. The particular knock. 2 knocks. A pause. Then one more. Every military spouse knows that knock. You hear it in your nightmares long before it ever arrives at your actual door. I turned off the stove before I answered. I remember that. Some part of me already knew what was coming, and even in the middle of the worst moment of my life, the part of me trained to prevent catastrophe reached for the burner knob first. Because eggs left unattended start fires, and fires are something I can control. The chaplain's words, I could not. Nathan was the steady one. That was the joke between us, the 2 of us late at night on the back porch with a bottle of cheap Merlot between us after Jackson was asleep. I fought wars overseas. He fought spreadsheets and inventory databases, and the maddening bureaucracy of Army communications logistics. I carried a weapon. He carried a security clearance, and a reputation for being the most careful, most methodical NCO in his entire brigade. He used to say, "Somebody has to hold the fort, Grace. Might as well be the guy who's good at math." He was 39, runner's build he never lost. A jaw that always needed shaving by 2 p.m. This quiet way of looking at you like he already knew what you were about to say before you said it. I loved him the way you love someone after 14 years. Not the fireworks kind, but the load-bearing kind. The kind you don't examine because you're too busy leaning on it. Then came the call from the Coast Guard, and after that, the funeral. I stood at graveside in my dress uniform, because I couldn't bring myself to wear anything else. Some instinct that if I stood at attention long enough, I could hold myself together through sheer muscle memory. Jackson held my hand the entire service. He didn't cry. He stared straight ahead with this expression I recognized from my own face in photographs from my first deployment. The look of a person who has decided that holding completely still might make the terrible thing happening around them lose interest and move on. Nathan's mother, Deborah, wept loudly enough that people 3 rows back turned their heads. She was a woman who had always filled rooms with her presence, large gestures, loud opinions, the kind of mother-in-law who rearranged your kitchen cabinets during visits, and then acted hurt when you noticed. She clutched a tissue in one hand, and Nathan's sister Christine's arm with the other. Christine stood beside her, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue that never quite seemed to make contact with actual tears. I watched her the way I used to watch terrain during reconnaissance, looking for what didn't add up. Something didn't add up. It hadn't added up for years, if I'm honest with myself. But grief has a way of making you generous with people you shouldn't trust. 3 days after the funeral, my phone rang at 11:20 p.m. A Fort Liberty prefix. I almost didn't answer. I'd had enough condolence calls from people I barely remembered to last a lifetime. Something made me pick up. Captain Cole. The voice was clipped, controlled. The voice of a man accustomed to classified briefings and secured lines. This is Colonel David Mercer, 2nd Signal Brigade. Nathan's commanding officer. I'd met him once at a unit family day. Tall, silver-haired, sharp. The kind of officer who looked like he'd been carved from the same granite as the Pentagon. Colonel Mercer, it's late. I know what time it is. A pause. Then, lower. Captain, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Your husband maintained a safety deposit box at the Navy Federal Credit Union branch on Riley Road. Box 1174. The key is taped inside the battery compartment of the emergency radio in his go bag. The one in the hall closet. I sat up in the dark. Nathan's side of the bed. Still made. Still untouched. The glass of water on his nightstand. 11 days old. Still half full. I hadn't been able to pour it out. Pouring it out would mean he wasn't coming back to drink it. And some irrational, desperate corner of my mind was still holding the door open for a man who would never walk through it again. Why are you telling me this at 11 at night? Because I don't believe your husband's death was an accident. The words landed like ordnance, each one detonating a fraction of a second after the last. And I don't believe I'm the only person who knows that box exists. Another pause. And in that pause I heard something that didn't belong in the voice of a full-bird colonel with 3 decades of service. I heard fear. Grace, listen to me. Don't tell his family. Don't tell Deborah. Don't tell Christine. Don't tell anyone where you're going. Go to that box tomorrow morning, first thing, alone. Do you understand me? I understand. The line went dead. I sat in the dark for a very long time. The house creaked around me, the settling sounds of a building that used to feel like home and now felt like a crime scene I hadn't yet learned to process. Then I got up, walked to the hall closet, and found Nathan's go bag exactly where it always was, the olive-drab duffel he kept packed and ready the way all soldiers do. I unzipped the outer pocket and pulled out the emergency radio, a battered yellow Kaito he'd owned since before we married. I popped the battery compartment with my thumbnail. A small brass key fell into my palm, taped to a scrap of paper in Nathan's handwriting. 2 words. For Grace. I drove to Navy Federal at 07:30. Jackson was already at school. The branch was nearly empty, just a teller and a security guard reading a newspaper. The woman behind the desk checked my military ID, my marriage certificate, and the death certificate I'd been carrying in my purse for 11 days, because I kept needing it for paperwork, and because some irrational part of me believed that setting it down would make it permanent. Box 1174, lower row. I carried it to the private viewing room and sat down. Inside, a leather folio tied with a cord, a sealed manila envelope marked Grace, open alone in Nathan's handwriting, a USB flash drive in a clear case, and a small black notebook, the kind he carried in his cargo pocket during deployments, filled cover to cover with his cramped, careful print. I opened the envelope first. A typed letter, dated 3 weeks before his death. Grace, if you're reading this, then what I was afraid of has happened, and I'm sorry I couldn't tell you while I was still here to explain it in person. I found something I wasn't supposed to find. It started with money and ended with your family. The notebook has everything. The drive has copies. Colonel Mercer knows enough to point you in the right direction, but the full picture is in these pages. Trust Mercer. Trust Major Patricia Hahn at the JAG office, extension 4481. Don't trust Deborah. Don't trust Christine. I know how that sounds. I know you love them. I loved them too. Once. Before I knew what they were capable of. Read the notebook first, and then decide for yourself who deserves your trust. I did all of this because Jackson deserves to grow up with everything your father intended for him to have. I'm sorry I couldn't finish it. Finish it for me. All my love. Always. N. I read it 3 times. The 3rd time, my hands were shaking so badly the paper rattled against the table. Not fear. Something past fear. The particular tremor that comes when your body understands something your mind hasn't caught up to yet. I opened the notebook. What Nathan had built over 8 months was not a journal. It was an intelligence dossier. He'd used the same analytical framework I'd taught him years ago over dinner. Half joking, the methodology military intelligence uses to map networks. Identify the nodes, trace the connections, follow the money until it tells you what people actually want, not what they say they want. The money led to my father. My father, Robert Callahan, had been a retired lieutenant colonel, a man who spent 30 years in the Army and another 20 managing his finances with the same discipline he brought to everything. He died of pancreatic cancer 4 years ago, during my 3rd deployment. By the time I made it home for the funeral, most of the estate had already been handled. Deborah had married my father 6 years before his death, and she'd positioned herself as the responsible one, the one who managed the paperwork while his health declined. To spare you the burden, she'd told me over a satellite phone connection, from a classified facility in a country I still can't name. You focus on your mission, sweetheart. We'll take care of everything here. I'd let her. I'd been grateful. I'd signed the power of attorney she FedExed to my forward operating base, and I hadn't read every page because I was running a signals intelligence operation in a war zone, and I trusted the woman who'd been married to my father for 6 years and who called me sweetheart. Nathan didn't trust her. Nathan was the guy who was good at math. He'd started investigating 11 months before his death, after Deborah asked him to co-sign a document transferring my father's brokerage account into a new trust entity, one that would have quietly removed me as primary beneficiary and placed control entirely in Deborah and Christine's hands. Nathan refused to sign. He didn't tell me, he told Colonel Mercer, because Mercer had a background in military legal affairs, and because Nathan didn't know who else he could trust with something this close to home. What Nathan documented over the next 8 months, page by painstaking page, was a systematic diversion of my father's estate. Forged signatures on trust amendments, falsified beneficiary designations on insurance policies, a brokerage account restructured without my knowledge or consent while I was deployed and unable to review the paperwork, a small network of professionals, an attorney in Norfolk, an insurance broker in Richmond, a financial advisor who had retired conveniently to Florida, who had helped Deborah and Christine redirect assets that were legally mine and Jackson's. The total, circled 3 times on the last page in red ink, $486,000. Not millions, not a fantasy number, a real number. A house, a college fund, a retirement. The kind of money a military family builds over decades of careful discipline. The kind of money that someone with access and paperwork can quietly dismantle if the rightful owner is 7,000 miles away carrying a rifle instead of a calculator. I closed the notebook. I sat in that private room at Navy Federal for 22 minutes without moving. Then I called extension 4481. Major Patricia Hahn was a JAG attorney with 20 years of experience and the unshakable calm of a woman who had heard every version of human greed and stopped being surprised by any of them. She met me that afternoon in a conference room at the JAG office on post. She read Nathan's notebook cover to cover in silence. She examined every document. When she looked up, her expression was not shocked. It was focused. "Your husband built a prosecution file," she said. "This isn't evidence someone stumbled across. This is a case built by someone who understood he might not be alive to present it." She read his letter. She read it twice. She set it down. "Captain Cole, do you believe his death is connected to what he found?" I thought about the boating accident. Nathan didn't drink on boats. He'd been a communications specialist for 20 years, a man who followed protocol the way other people followed religion, and the investigation had been closed in 72 hours. "I think my husband told Deborah he knew what she was doing," I said. "And 3 weeks later, he was dead." Patricia nodded. "I'll make some calls." Within a week, she'd contacted NISIS, because Nathan's death occurred in coastal waters under Navy jurisdiction, and flagged the closed investigation for reopening. Meanwhile, I did what soldiers do. I ran the mission. I became the widow they expected. Soft, confused, grateful for help. I answered Deborah's calls with the broken voice of a woman too shattered to think about money. I let Christine come to the house with folders of paperwork, let her walk me through documents about simplifying the trust and protecting Jackson's future, nodding along with vacant eyes while a recording device the size of a thumbnail captured every word from the shelf where Nathan's deployment photographs sat watching over the room like witnesses. I signed nothing. Patricia had told me, not a single document until she cleared it. So I stalled. I asked confused widow questions. I said the words were blurring together. I said I needed more time. They believed me, because they'd spent years believing I was too busy, too deployed, too trusting to look closely. They underestimated Nathan, and they underestimated me. 6 weeks after the funeral, I walked into a conference room at the Fort Liberty JAG Center in my dress uniform, with Patricia Hahn on my right and Colonel Mercer on my left. Across the table sat Deborah, Christine, their attorney from Norfolk, and at the far end, 2 NCIS investigators who had been quietly building a case for a month. Deborah was wearing a new dress, cream-colored, freshly done hair, the particular glow of a woman who believed today was the day everything finally became hers. Patricia opened a laptop and began. She walked them through everything, the forged signatures, compared against my father's authenticated handwriting from his military service records, the falsified trust amendments, the brokerage transfers, the insurance policy modifications, the $486,000 that had been systematically redirected over 4 years while I served my country overseas. Christine's face drained of color around the 3rd document. Her attorney's pen stopped moving around the 5th. Deborah sat very still. Then Patricia played Nathan's video. He'd recorded it on his phone 6 weeks before he died, sitting at the desk in our spare bedroom with the door closed, speaking quietly into the camera the way he spoke about everything, without drama, without self-pity, with the quiet precision of a man who understood that facts, arranged properly, are more devastating than any accusation. Near the end, his voice dropped. The only moment the composure cracked. I told Deborah 3 weeks ago that I knew what she was doing. I told her I had evidence. She looked me in the eye, and she said something I'll never forget. She said, "Nathan, be careful about making accusations you can't take back. People get hurt when they don't know when to stop. I'm not stopping. But if something happens to me, start there." The room was silent. The NC's investigator stood. "Mrs. Deborah Callahan, we have questions regarding the financial activities documented in this file and the circumstances surrounding Nathan Cole's death. We'd like to continue this conversation at our field office." Deborah smoothed the front of her new dress. She looked across the table at me. "Grace, you don't understand. Your father's estate was complicated. I was trying to protect you from— You were trying to protect yourself," I said. "And Nathan died because he tried to protect me." She didn't have an answer for that. The investigation took 4 more months. Incius worked with civilian authorities in Norfolk and Richmond. The network Deborah had built was unraveled thread by thread. Every forged signature, every redirected account, every professional who had helped her strip a deployed soldier's inheritance, while that soldier was overseas defending the country that was supposed to protect her rights at home. Nathan's death was reclassified. Not as homicide, the evidence couldn't definitively reach that conclusion, but as suspicious and unresolved. The investigation was formally reopened. One of the men on that boat, it turned out, had financial ties to the same Norfolk attorney who had helped Deborah restructure my father's trust. Whether that connection proved what I believed in my bones it proved, remained a question I learned to carry without a verdict. Some truths don't come with courtroom conclusions. You hold them anyway. You hold them because the alternative is pretending they don't exist, and I've spent too many years reading intelligence reports to pretend that a coincidence is anything other than a pattern someone hasn't finished tracing. Deborah pleaded guilty to fraud, forgery, and obstruction. Christine cooperated and received probation and restitution. The $486,000 was recovered and placed in a trust for Jackson, structured exactly the way my father's original will intended, reviewed quarterly by Patricia Hahn's office. I kept serving. I took a new posting that fall. Jackson started 4th grade. He joined a soccer league. He made a friend named Marcus who came over for dinner on Wednesdays and always asked for seconds. The nightmares stopped in November. On the anniversary of Nathan's death, I drove to the cemetery alone. I sat beside his headstone on the grass for a long time, saying nothing, because everything I needed to say I'd already said in the months of work that followed. In every document filed, every recording reviewed, every quiet morning I'd shown up at Patricia's office in a pressed uniform, with steady hands, and a folder full of evidence my husband spent the last year of his life building, because he loved me and Jackson enough to fight a war we didn't know was happening. The last page of his notebook, the one I hadn't read until that morning because I'd known somehow it was meant for last, contained a single line in his small, careful handwriting. "You were always the brave one. I was just the guy who was good at math." I traced the words with my finger. I closed the notebook. I drove home to our son. If this story stayed with you, I'd love to hear which part hit you the hardest. Drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from tonight. And if you want more stories like this, subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss what's coming next. Thank you for staying with me through this one. Take care of yourselves, and take care of the people who fight for you quietly, especially the ones you don't know are fighting.